You were saying that the political situation in Ukraine, though, might be changing,
Well, yeah, it's
right?
really quite interesting. I just think it's quite revealing. There have been many personnel changes following the dismissal of Yermak, who was regarded as the number two man. Sometimes people even said he was number one. Um, uh, he was, he became the object of these investigations by the anti-corruption agencies. And there's a lot of, talk. Maybe this was the Americans were doing this to pressure the Ukrainians to, actually to, submit or agree to their peace plan. I don't see any evidence of that. I don't think that was ever true. First of all, these anti-corruption agencies are now much closer to the Europeans, and the people that staff them are liberal internationalists who hate Trump, and I don't think and also who hate the peace plan, they're like the most pro-war faction in all of Ukraine. This is, it's maybe counterintuitive, but maybe it shouldn't be. Like, the Greens in Germany are the most pro-war. So times have changed. I remember when the Greens were the peaceniks, and anyway, that's the distant past. That's the new reality. Is the liberals are the hawks, and it's very, very true in Ukraine. So anyway, they did manage to get rid of Yermak. And exactly why that is, there are all kinds of theories. I think, partly, yeah, they really, in general, Yermak was very, very unpopular. He was especially unpopular with these liberal nationalists, but also with the Europeans, the Americans, with all kinds of people, both in Ukraine and in among the supporting countries. So he's gone, but yet he's not gone. Remember, he said he was going to go to the front lines, and well, that never happened. I don't think anybody was shocked by that. He's still there in Kiev, and apparently he meets with Zelensky every day. He's still, it wasn't really his office that gave him the power. It was his personal connections. And those personal connections, haven't disappeared. So he's still a major player. I think he's dropped a notch as a result of this, but he's still there. He's still exerting influence. Now, he was replaced by Budanov, right? The former head of the GUR, the military intelligence. And this guy, quite a character, sociopath, somebody who just clearly, like he openly said, just enjoys killing Russians. And likes the dark. That's what he told, he likes to be interviewed in the dark. I like the dark. His background, came out of the neo-Nazi soccer hooligan scene in Odessa. That's where he comes from. But now, to his credit, he has shown himself to be more realistic over, especially the last year. He's been saying, look, we're losing this war. Maybe that's because, in charge of military intelligence, he's really very well informed about it. And we need to negotiate, and the weaker party cannot set the terms. He actually said all those things, which is quite remarkable. And now he's, the head of this, of Zelensky's office. He's what we would call the chief of staff. Now, that position doesn't give him tremendous power. Again, Yermak had tremendous power because he was Yermak. And now, why is Budanov in there? I've heard like a half a dozen theories, and I'm not going to go through them. I would just say that it wasn't Zelensky's first choice. He would rather have Yermak still there, but he was pressured, and he had to let go of him. Yermak was unpopular. Budanov is actually more popular, quite a bit more popular within Ukraine. But he also has independent, or people believe he has independent political ambitions. So some people say that, well, Zelensky put him there so he can keep an eye on him, and actually it'd be easier for him to control him. So who knows? Anyway, but he's there. He's also supposed to have very good connections with the CIA. That's another thing. But he's no longer the head of military intelligence. So we'll see if that may have actually reduced the CIA's influence. But it's hard to say. Now, there have been other personnel changes, quite a few, and it's hard to look at and say a real clear picture. I think it just comes down to Zelensky trying to, maintain his hold on power, making certain compromises where he needs to, but then also, shuffling people around in a way that he feels will actually, keep him in power for the foreseeable future. And one very interesting change is, well, he got rid of the head of the SBU, Malyuk. And I think everybody in Ukraine agrees that he did that because Malyuk let him down last fall. Remember when the anti-corruption protests occurred? He was trying to shut down those agencies because they were going after his friends and allies. And then he was forced to retreat. Well, he had told the SBU basically, arrest those guys, meaning the anti-corruption people. And Malyuk disobeyed orders. He didn't do it. So ever since, Zelensky has been looking for a chance to get rid of him. Now he has gotten rid of him. And he's replaced him with some guy named, I think it's Kamar or something like that. He's not all that interesting, but then also a deputy. There's the deputy director of the SBU, which is the main, the secret service, the main security service within Ukraine. Now, this person has a very interesting past, kind of like Budanov. He, back in the 1990s, he actually joined a police force. I believe that it was in Poltava, in central Ukraine, and he actually joined the anti-organized crime unit. Then, like 6 months later, he was arrested for working for organized crime. He was sentenced to 6 years. That was later commuted to 2.5 years. And then once he gets out, what does he do? He immediately gets employment with organized crime. And he was with the organized crime for, for the next decade. And during that time, he was actually hitman for them. And he developed a reputation for being particularly brutal. He has the nickname the Strangler, because apparently he liked to, these victims or detainees of the organized crime, he would personally strangle. And he said, people said, these are the stories anyway, that it gave him a great deal of pleasure. And during that time, though, it's like he worked very closely with police forces, with the courts. And, it just seems like this is Ukraine that we're talking about. And he also made a friend named Yermak around 2010. And then he got, not too long afterwards, the employment with the SBU, and he's, worked his way up. He was the head of the assassination unit at one time in the SBU, and now he's the deputy director. So anyway, I just think it's very revealing. It's just, this is Ukraine. This is the Ukrainian government. These are the kind of people at the top. I mean, this is, you find, people say, oh, they're very dark aspects to Russian society. I think you can say any society. There are dark corners there, and you can find them in Russia. But in Russia, they're being, with every passing year under Putin, those dark corners are getting smaller and smaller. We've talked about that they have their own ultra-nationalist, unit, but they keep it on a tight leash, and it's pretty small. In Ukraine, we have the Third Army Corps. It's huge. It's just like they're basically those people are running the show in the military anyway in Ukraine. And then you look at, these organized crime, and we're not talking about just any kind of organized crime, but the most brutal kind of organized crime. And these are the people, they rise to the top. That is the Zelensky regime.
Oof, that's scary.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, to think that your country is being run by these type of people. I mean, and that's why it's, we laugh at Lindsey Graham, but that's what, that's also just a symptom of scary. Just like you have these bad men, and somehow that are not representative of what men are normally like. This is an anomaly. This is like 0.1% most evil people, but somehow in our systems they seem to rise to the top.
Yeah,
or definitely in Ukraine they are.
Yeah, well, ours is a combination. It seems like the most incompetent, and then the most power hungry. That's the problem with politics in general, is it attracts people who are power hungry, right? That's the occupational hazard. And yeah, you can see the consequences. Again, in Ukraine, it's just like, it's like the 1990s never really ended. The 1990s Russia was, so much of society was run basically by organized crime. And that has been changing. It didn't happen overnight. But once Putin took power, it just sort of, bit by bit, he's been moving Russia away from that. The victory isn't total. There's still aspects of the society, where you still see a little bit of the 1990s still there. But in Ukraine, it never left. And if anything, it seems to have gotten worse.
Do you see Ukraine holding on much longer? Will they make it through the winter? I mean, what is the situation right now?
Yeah, well, it's become very grim for the civilians, in places like Kiev. I mean, it's really, again, they're in the midst of winter, and most of them are without power. They only get power for, if some of them, many of them haven't had power for days. Others get power for just a couple of hours a day. It really makes life very difficult for them, and people are suffering. And this is something new. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the Russian plan is. One possibility is that they are planning actually to take Kiev. And so they do want people to leave Kiev. Again, the mayor has said, if you got a place to go, just leave. Look, we can't take care of you here now. Zelensky is very upset about that, but I think the Klitschko was just telling them the truth. But very recently, the Russians have begun to make some moves where they haven't moved before. I mean, they're very small moves, but they have crossed the borders in places like Belgorod and Sumy, or the Chernigov region, which is directly north of Kiev. In locations that are, put them on roads to Kiev, let's say. And these are very small moves now, but it may be but everything begins small, or quite often big operations begin small. And maybe that's what we're seeing, is that this is part of a plan to take Kiev. I don't know, but I'm just going to throw that out there as a possibility.
Yeah. Also, if the power is out in Kiev, I imagine people are suffering. Is this kind of maybe a playbook as well to have the people turn against their government, say, end this war? We can't win this. This needs to stop. Do you think that's also a possibility?
It might be. One thing is, like, for the longest time, the Russians really hadn't done anything to Kiev. There, occasional strikes and so on and so forth. But Kiev was relatively untouched until just, the last few months. This is where the power is concentrated, and you still had this, maybe they're just observing this tremendous arrogance, the sense of confidence. They always got those stupid, country bumpkins. Those are the ones who are being sent to the front. It wasn't the rich and well-connected Kievans who ever had to pay, and they were living comfortably there in Kiev, and now, the war is coming home to them. So maybe that's part of what's going on. I really don't know. But then also another thing to point out is that, again, electricity is, as the Americans themselves have admitted, and many others have admitted over the years and decades, is dual use. And so it's not just civilian homes that aren't heated, but it's also, drone manufacturing plants and so on that are not able to run.
Okay. Are we seeing any much movement on the battlefront right now, on the front lines?
Well, it slowed down for a while. And again, that may have been a combination of weather and the holiday season. And it seems to be picking up again. Now, one thing is, I just saw actually a graph that shows the advances. If you compare last year, 2025, to the previous year, 2024, there's clearly more territory was taken last year. But overall, not maybe, I'll just make a guess, 30% more, 40%. So it's not a huge increase, a huge acceleration, but an acceleration. Now, towards the end of the year, though, there really wasn't much a difference. If you compare, let's say, fall of 2024 to fall of 2025, it's about the same in terms of total square kilometers. However, there's a huge qualitative difference. It's just that in the fall of 2024, the Russians were basically taking fields and small, towns or settlements, really, villages. In 2025, they take the same amount of territory, but a lot of that was urban territory. They took Pokrovsk, they took Mirnograd, they took Seversk, which was, again, a real small town, but very, very important, a real fortress town. and they took a big chunk of Konstantinovka. They took a big chunk of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians counterattacked there, but still, it looks like the Russians have most of Kupiansk and are slowly pushing back against those counterattacks. So even though you see at the fall, there wasn't a change, any big difference in terms of total area taken between 2024 and 2025. There's a qualitative difference. You're taking major, towns, real fortresses. And so I think overall you compare 2024 to 2025 and you see that it was, the Russians did a lot more in 2025 than they did in 2024. And the Ukrainians did a lot less. I think the only success, if you want to call it that the Ukrainians had was a counterattack in Kupiansk where they managed to push back the Russians in the western part of the town, but they haven't been able to actually consolidate those gains. It's basically a gray zone, if I understand correctly, in western Kupiansk, and the Russians will end up taking it. So that's all that they had to show as far as, their counterattacks or counteroffenses, which is a big contrast from previous years, including 2024, when they did Kursk.
Is there a realization now coming amongst European leaders that this war can't be won? I saw something about Macron saying that we got to talk to Putin now. Like,
yeah.
is there some change or not really?
Yeah, I don't know. Macron says these things every once in a while, but he usually doesn't follow up on it. Meloni's also saying that they need to talk to him. You see hints, kind of like asides, I think it was the president of Czechoslovakia said something similar. The Merz made a very interesting comment. Merz is again, we know he's almost like the Lindsey Graham of Germany, as far as I can tell, but with a real, let's say, Nazi look about him. But he was speaking about this coalition of the willing plan. The French and the British were going to send these troops. And he said, basically, this doesn't mean anything because the Russians have to agree to it. And that was, kind of surprising coming from Merz, but I think it's happening. This realism, this acknowledgement of the realities is growing, but very gradually. And it still hasn't caused them to make any significant changes in their policies or their approach to the war. They're still on the same track. We got to support Ukraine. We got to send them arms. We got to send them money. But they're having trouble doing it. Even just sending the money. As we know, there was that big struggle to steal the frozen Russian assets. That didn't work out, and then they worked out something else. But it's not clear that's it's just going to fall short. It's not going to be nearly enough.
Yeah, well, it feels like Ukraine can't hang on that much longer. I mean, we're talking about Kiev is having trouble keeping the lights on, and the mayor Klitschko is saying, leave. And we're talking about getting close to evacuating the capital, or and the same thing. I imagine people in Odessa and Kharkiv. At some point, if they're not having any power and they're getting hit hard, and it looks like the Russians are going to take these cities, there's an evacuation order. It's over. It's over, right?
Yeah,
I just feel like we got to be getting close.
It clearly is. I mean, anybody who's being realistic about it say, yeah, you're losing, you will lose. And again, the smart thing to do is just accept the deal that the Russians have on the table. I don't think it's going to be on the table much longer. But it would be the smart thing to do, but it's just politically impossible. It's not something, because of the ultra nationalists and the liberal nationalists or whatever, they would just probably literally murder Zelensky if he tried to do it at this point. So what I just repeat what I said earlier. Actually, when the Russians do take Donbass, they do take the four oblasts. At that point, that may be the last chance for a deal if the Russians are willing to make one at that point. Right? They would.
Probably not.
Yeah, because maybe at that point, the Ukrainians will be so weak that the Russians would just say, we have them completely on the ropes. We'll take Odessa. We know that we need it because they've been using it to launch all these attacks on us. So just forget it. It's too late. You guys had your chance, But at that point, the Ukrainians might say, oh, okay, we'll stop now because now the ceasefire line is the four oblasts plus these so-called buffer zones. But it may be too late for the Ukrainians at that point.
Yeah. I predict that as we end up with a rout and a true collapse on our hands, that the blame will be shifted over to the United States, and rightly so. I think, and the Europeans will need a scapegoat if they realize that they just cannot go to war with Russia, even though they're talking about it constantly. It's just they don't have the capacity or the ability and that hard constraint. The only political out I can see for these people is to shift the blame to the United States. And it's pretty easy when the United States is saying we're going to invade Greenland, and we're on video saying we blew up your pipeline.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff to be angry about, and
Yeah.
I think that's the only way that this will go, and this will just lead to further isolation of the United States. I don't know how long it'll play
Right.
out, but the truth will prevail eventually. And the one that's all this death and destruction is over, people will look around and say, why the hell did this happen? And we're going to have to look at the U.S. We
Yeah,
are
well, you
the
may be right. One thing is how much will they be able to just pin this all on Trump? Well, obviously they can't for Nord Stream, right? That's Biden. But they will try to pin it all on Trump, and then hope that a Democrat will come in power and everything will be fine again. I'm sure that many of them are hoping that. I just don't know that that's going to happen. We'll see, or they can wait that long. Or even if a Democrat came in, if things would really change that much. Again, people are always surprised. They assume that, they're going to reverse these things. Like, Biden was going to reinstate the JCPOA and would ease tensions with China. Nothing changed. It was like Trump set the course in his first term, and then Biden continued it. And maybe Greenland would be an exception and say, that was, because this is perhaps if the Democrats took power, they would say, we're going to reverse this, but maybe not. I think there's a good chance they wouldn't. They say, now it's ours. We'll just keep it,
Mm. Yeah, well, there's a lot happening. Things are changing so fast. I feel like
Yeah.
this is just history in the making that we're just living through. The biggest events probably in the past, would you say potential? Well, I don't know. I don't want to compare to World War I, World War II, but just in
Yeah.
terms of Western dominance of the world, that's been
Yeah.
500 years, and it's ending right now. We're watching it collapse in
Yeah,
real
I
time.
think it's fair to say, this is the end of we're coming to the end of a long, period of Western dominance. And then, we also are seeing, the end of the post-World War II order that seemed so stable not too long ago. It's obviously no longer stable. You can just see the cracks everywhere in the foundations.